So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's short briefing. I will begin with activities that had been undertaken over the past week by the Prime Minister before I proceed to the second part of the briefing, which should be on current issues. So on July 22nd and the 23rd, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed met with the Council of Ministers to review the performance of sectoral activities during the course of the Ethiopian calendar 2013 budget year. So what had been undertaken in the past year had been reviewed, and the ministers have also achieved important milestones over the course of the past year, despite the many challenges that the nation has been confronted with. To name a few of these milestones, although it has been widely explored, first, agricultural crop productivity has shown remarkable progress over the past year, particularly in Ethiopia's efforts to substitute wheat imports through enabling national productivity. So if you've been following closely over the past year, there has been a lot of initiatives that have been undertaken by the Ministry of Agriculture at the federal level in collaboration with regions to ensure that wheat productivity is at the forefront of Ethiopia's food self-sufficiency efforts. Gold export performance has also been quite positive over the course of the past year, as reported by the Ministry of Mines and Petroleum. And this also shows efforts are being made to grow the sector in addition to artisanal mining. Another key milestone is strengthening and reach of other forms of health services that have been continuing through the initiative of the Ministry of Health alongside what the nation has been confronted with, as the rest of the world has with the COVID-19 pandemic. However, these different healthcare service provisions have also continued for other parts of the country and other citizens, including those that have been displaced by various issues, including conflict and natural disasters. So despite the multidimensional challenges the nation has been confronted with, resilience has also been the hallmark of the country's economy, as reported with a 20% increase in export revenue. So this is just to give you a flavor of some of the key milestones as reported within the annual performance of the Council of Ministers. So in reviewing these key milestones and also evaluating the gaps of implementation against set targets, this is to enable better direction to be set for the upcoming budget year according to the Ethiopian calendar 2014, and in government's efforts of exploring ways of further strengthening the economy and achieving targets that have been set within the National 10-Year Perspective Plan. Relatedly, and it's important to update because we're almost halfway, or we've passed the halfway mark for the Green Legacy Initiative. So to provide an update on the Prime Minister's National Green Legacy Initiative, activities are progressing nationwide. Reports from the Green Legacy Committee shows a 70% performance thus far in the nationwide planting schemes. And just to reiterate again, the Green Legacy Initiative, as we know it, is an initiative that has multifaceted attributes to the nation. It has been put in place or instituted to support sustainable agricultural development and food self-sufficiency. Also, with Ethiopia's attempts to be a climate resilient country and in its efforts to tackle climate change, enhancing forestry, enabling sustainable water resource development. So we have already intimated before that beyond the national efforts in this year's Green Legacy Initiative, neighboring countries have also been onboarded, and there are activities that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will update you on as far as how that is progressing. So to conclude this part, we still encourage all Ethiopians and friends of Ethiopians that are residing within the country to support in meeting this year's target by continuing to plant their print, as many other entities are doing so. Moving to the second part of today's briefing, as it relates to the situation in the northern part of the country. It is to be recalled that the government has been engaged in various rounds of humanitarian assistance and rehabilitation initiatives in the region. The last time that we had met as part of this briefing was before the humanitarian ceasefire. And so just to further reiterate again activities that had transpired prior to the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire, we recall that the efforts by the government in the first round, distribution of humanitarian assistance had been made for 4.5 million people throughout the region. The second distribution was aimed at 4.5 million people, and in the third round, according to data from the relevant stakeholder, up to 4.9 million up to 4.9 million people had been reached in humanitarian assistance. And in the third round particularly, you would recall that this was being done in consortium or in cooperation with different international partners as well. As of June 29th, 2021, the federal government made a unilateral humanitarian ceasefire. And this ceasefire was enacted, as has been shared before, to enable farming activities from being interrupted. Otherwise, any further disruption to the farming activities of those within the region will have devastating consequences, particularly for food security within the next year, meaning the Ethiopian calendar. And in that regard, prior to the humanitarian ceasefire, up to 500 or more than 580,000 quintals of fertilizer had been purchased, with more than 530,000 quintals that had been stored within storages in Mekelle and also distributed through cooperatives or through 10 cooperatives within the region. And with related to the departure of the defense forces as part of the humanitarian ceasefire, when they were exiting Mekelle, or at the point in time of exiting Mekelle, more than 400,000 quintals of wheat and 2.5 million liters of edible oil had been stocked in warehouses for distribution to those that were in need. And this is also, in addition to that, around 14 million liters of fuel had also been left in depot for any needs within the region. So an interesting thing that we need to particularly pay attention to is what has transpired after the humanitarian or the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire had been put in place. As I had shared with you already, this unilateral humanitarian ceasefire was enacted by the government solely intended to enable humanitarian assistance for farmers to utilize the rainy season. You would recall that there was a lot of international outcry. There was a lot of outcry about enabling this access to support civilians reclaim their livelihoods. So in that effort, the government did take this decision that was a political decision as well as a security decision that was reached through deliberations within the National Security Council. However, the TPLF have outright rejected the ceasefire, and this has been made public, and rather pushed the people of the region into further risk. Following the government ceasefire, TPLF have continued with their belligerence and fatalistic approach of encroachment into other regions. So it's not something that has remained contained within the Tigray region, but this encroachment has gone further into the Amhara and Afar regions. So instead of taking this opportunity to support or taking the unilateral ceasefire to support Tigrayan farmers and those in need of humanitarian assistance within the region, as that was a huge outcry even from their end, they have resorted to mobilizing civilians as human shields and violently harassing communities in the Amhara and Afar regions, as well as within the Tigray region. Particularly the lives of farmers in the Amhara region and pastoralists in the Afar region are being destabilized by the terrorist enterprise that has resorted to further escalating the situation rather than de-escalating it, and this humanitarian ceasefire provided that opportunity to de-escalate further. However, here, as you may have noted, the international community and particularly also the international media have been shockingly mute with regards to this. We have reports of women's farming monasteries in the Amhara region that have been targeted and looted while the women fled and hid in the forest till the TPLF recruits left. We have also evidence surfacing of utilizing children as combatants by the TPLF, employing and utilizing illegal substances to encourage them. In this regard, the federal government asserts to the very quiet international community on this particular matter, that children are not soldiers and civilians need not be utilized as human shield for the TPLF's destructive exploits. There are also reports that indicate that food assistance that I mentioned to you, about 400 or more than 400,000 quintals of wheat that had been left in storage for the needy, is being exploited by the TPLF for recruitment. Humanitarian assistance in transit to the region has also been blocked from reaching those in need by the group. Furthermore, we also have been receiving reports of killing of Tigrayans considered pro-government by the TPLF and who are residing within the region. Confirming the group's exploitation and violence against the very people in whose name it says it is standing for. Another point of concern for the federal government as well as partners supporting the case of refugees is the safety of Eritrean refugees within the Tigray region, which is threatened with the presence of TPLF forces, particularly in refugee hosting areas. Reports of up to 6 killings of refugees have come in so far. The properties of the Agency for Refugee and Returnee Affairs and other partner properties, including the World Food Programme warehouses, have been looted and items confiscated, as reported by ARA. Refugees are being forced to contribute in kind and in cash to rebels. Adding all to this, all efforts by the refugees to move out of the conflict zone has also been prevented, giving the impression of a hostage situation. On the contrary, there are reports of forceful transportation also of refugees, trying to relocate them to 2 refugee sites that had been folded by the federal government because of the insecurity that had prevailed in that area even prior to the rule of law operations having begun. And this refugee camps had been closed following the attacks in November 2020 by the TPLF, but now we are getting reports that there's efforts to move them back to that area. So while all these very overt, egregious acts are being committed by the TPLF, they're also very open and vocal belligerence against the stability and security of the state has escalated with these blatant statements and threats to attack other regions and the capital as well. So this silence around that, particularly around international communities, is something that needs to be once again raised and questioned. Despite the challenges that the current situation has opened, and following the unilateral ceasefire, the government is continuing to work with partners to assuage the challenges of humanitarian assistance delivery. There has been, as I mentioned earlier, an outcry with regards to the need for humanitarian assistance. Nevertheless, the government is working closely with partners, and humanitarian aid supply and distribution system guidelines, transport system guidelines have now been developed to facilitate the humanitarian coordination with partners that are active in trying to find a way to deliver assistance. Related to the blatant statements and this overt hostility that is now at play from the TPLF side, the public response, particularly the Ethiopian public response to these aggressions against the state and to the nations and nationalities of Ethiopia, has been met with the nationwide condemnation across the country, as you've witnessed over the past few days. The diaspora community, or Ethiopians living in foreign countries, have also added their voice to condemn the TPLF's aggression and violence. All across the country are mobilizing to thwart the threat declared by the TPLF, and many are also enlisting to join the National Defense Forces in what has become a national tagline of "I will march to save Ethiopia." Renouncing the TPLF as a terrorist organization and the need to reconcile with fellow Tigrayans who have deep roots, blood and familiar ties with other nations and nationalities has been expressed by many across the country. So this clear delineation of calling a spade, which is the threat posed by the TPLF criminal enterprise versus the people of Tigray that are also part of the fabric of the Ethiopian society. So this is something that has been repeatedly been expressed in public outcries over the past week. So despite the TPLF's attempt to wage a rift between the people of Tigray and their fellow Ethiopians for their personal political gains, Ethiopians all over have been very vocal in differentiating, as I told you, between the culprits and the innocent Tigrayans in whose name TPLF and their operatives continue to trade. I would like to say a little bit before I open it up to questions in terms of the response by the international community and the international media, who have at previous junctures been overtly vocal about support for the region. In developments following the government's decision to enact a humanitarian ceasefire and exit some of the cities, the international community's silence has been quite outstanding. I've repeated that and I want to re-emphasize that again. So a clear double standard seems to be at play in the silence towards TPLF's harassment and overt belligerence. So it's not a silent belligerence anymore, but these are statements that are being issued through various social media channels from spokespersons related with the rebel group about an attack on regions and the capital as well. Many that were echoing the well-being of Tigrayans in the region are now mute when the TPLF is blocking aid. When there's killing of Tigrayans, it considers against the TPLF structure. When it is recruiting child soldiers, we have seen a lot of evidence towards that and testimonies from child soldiers that have been apprehended by the security sector or the government security sector. Again, the international community has been quite mute when civilians are being used as human shields and bullet fodder, and when the TPLF is encroaching into other regions. There was a very loud narration and narrative about government forces and Amhara forces get out of the Tigray region, but now you have TPLF forces that have been designated as a terrorist organization encroaching into two regions, the Afar region and the Amhara region, and there is a dead silence with regards to that. So it begs the question of why. So three things that I want to draw your attention to again before I open up for questions. Number one, TPLF attacks the state in November 2020, dragging the federal government into a war. Secondly, the federal government enacts a humanitarian ceasefire, which TPLF rejects in June 2021. And three, TPLF escalates the conflict by encroaching into two other regions and openly declares violence. So these three critical threats against the state and the people of Ethiopia, and the international community is still quiet about it. So the question is why? I open it up to questions from you. Okay, we'll take one over here. Another one from Skander. Elias? No way. Okay, let's take this round and I'll come back.
Thank you.
There's a microphone coming your way.
Thank you. I have a few questions for you. You said that the TPLF is attacking civilians in the state of Amhara and Afar, creating or wreaking havoc there. But what is the government doing to defend civilians in both regions? Is the government still, or does the government still respect the unilateral ceasefire? We hear that there is an active war there. So if the government respects the unilateral ceasefire, who is fighting there? Can you tell us the real situation there? The next question, when it comes to the budget regarding the Tigray state, I think it's still up in the air. Is your government planning to release the budget to the state? And if yes, who is going to receive the budget? And if not, what is the plan forward? When your government declared a unilateral ceasefire, it mentioned that there might be entities in the TPLF who may resort to peaceful negotiations. Is there any development about it? Is your government ready to negotiate with the TPLF? Maybe the last question. Some international aid organizations are saying that they are running out of stock, maybe in a couple of days. What is your government planning to do to provide aid there? You're saying that the TPLF is blocking roads and aid is not being delivered properly. So what is your government planning to do in the coming weeks? Thank you.
Thank you. That was a four-part question. So I think in order to also give other people a chance, let's limit our questions to 2 parts. Elias, and then Iskander over here, and Noe over there.
All right, thank you. My first question relates to what seems to be flare-up of violence regarding the Afar Somali region or Eastern Ethiopia. There seems to have been some blockage of the Ethio-Djibouti rail line. Do you have any idea who is responsible in the blockage and what the government is doing about it to resolve it? And relating to that, this has been a long-standing issue or conflict between the Afar and Somali communities. In this regard, is there a medium to long-term plan by the government to solve this recurring deadly conflict? Solomon raised it a bit. My second question is about there are about 200 WFP trucks still stranded in Samara who have been not able to transport aid items to Tigray. What's the latest about it? Do you have any idea when they will leave for Tigray? And in the government side, what help or what measures are you taking to ensure that it reaches to the communities who are in need of this aid?
Yeah, just a quick question about the public response you were mentioning, about the recruitment. How many people were recruited, across which regions, and what kind of training they will have before going to the fight?
Thank you very much. I think this question was asked earlier as well. I mean, is unilateral ceasefire still on as far as the federal government is concerned? If you could respond to this question vis-a-vis, the mobilization underway in different parts of the country.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I will start with the query regarding the humanitarian ceasefire and the unilateral ceasefire. As I had intimated twice or 3 times in the opening part, the purpose of the unilateral ceasefire was to enable farming communities within the Tigray region who, if they miss the season, would have dire consequences for their livelihoods, because the region is known to be food insecure to begin with, prior to the rule of law operations and the attacks of the Northern Command by the TPLF. So it is important as part of government's efforts to support people within the region for these farmers to resume their normal activities and normal livelihoods. So together with that, and in ensuring that humanitarian assistance is also delivered, this humanitarian ceasefire, this unilateral humanitarian ceasefire was enacted, and government forces have been withdrawing. The federal government still stands by the unilateral ceasefire. It is not engaging in any offense. However, I have also shared with you that once the National Defense Forces have exited from certain cities, there has been a belligerent approach from the TPLF side, which is encroaching and advancing towards and provoking the National Defense Forces, and as well as other supporting units in that area. So this provocation has also crossed the boundaries of the Tigray region, has entered into 2 other regions as well. In this regard, again, the